regarding Airbnb. Dave has been, yeah, of course, he has been participating with ADCO on this issue, so he can give us an update on what's being proposed and what people are thinking as a
There's not a lot.
That we vote on something in terms of letters. I think it's
So what's being distributed around the room is the latest development from City Hall in terms of an ordinance that finally addresses the rapid growth of the short-term rental market, spearheaded by internet-based platforms like Airbnb. They're the largest one out there, but there's several other ones that are also would fall into the category that would be covered by the ordinance. By way of background, I guess it's been about 3 years in the works since, in response to initially residential complaints from downtown neighborhoods like the North End and Chinatown and other downtown areas that our state rep, Erin Michaelwitz, has been responding to, working on Beacon Hill to try to get some legislation passed through. And I understand you may have some favorable news for us on that front as well. But initially, the city was going to wait until we got some guidance from the state before they attempted to craft their own legislation covering short-term rentals. And in anticipation of legislation from or guidance from City Hall, ISD back in 2014 suspended enforcement of zoning requirements and inspections for short-term rental properties until it got some guidance from City Hall. And so more than 3 years later, we finally have something to look at. And the good news is that it does address a number of concerns that were initially raised by residents in Boston. I'm going to read from the press release that followed the ordinance. The ordinance was dated on the 19th. And on the 22nd, City Hall announced new regulations put forth in an ordinance aimed to capture the growth of Boston's growing home share industry while including deterrents to help prevent operators from monopolizing Boston's housing market with short-term rentals. In addition, the regulations provide a standardized framework for regulating these units that both meet the evolving needs of the industry, provide protections for occupants, and minimize the impact on surrounding neighborhoods for these short-term rental units. So in their attempt to provide the framework to regulate this sector of the economy, they came up with a three-tiered approach for classifying short-term rental units in the city of Boston. The first category is a limited share unit, which consists basically of a room or several rooms within a residence where the host, which is the term frequently used by Airbnb and other internet booking agents, to describe the operator. And the limited share unit consists of where the operator is present during the rental period, so he lives on the premises, like a traditional B&B would operate. The second category is a home share unit, which consists of an entire unit available for short-term rental at the primary residence of the operator. Here, the resident may be looking to rent out their property while they're away on vacation, or perhaps in the case of Boston residents, people who winter outside the city may want to use an Airbnb type platform to rent out their entire residence. And then the last category is something called investor units, and they consist of an entire unit available for short-term rental in a whole dwelling that is non-owner and non-tenant occupied. And then part of the regulation would require all of these hosts to register with the city, so that the city knows who is participating in this short-term rental market and what they're charging, how many nights people are staying there. And for each of these categories, the city has imposed specific restrictions that's detailed in the ordinance, the copies that you've looked at. For the limited share unit, where it's basically a resident who's looking to supplement his income and defray his housing expenses by letting out a room or number of rooms within his property, there's no limit as to how many nights during the period during a 1 year period that they can rent out that space in their residence. And there's still a registration requirement, but only a nominal licensing fee. For a home share unit, where the entire residence is being rented out by the owner, and the owner is not present during the rental period, there's a higher registration fee and, again, a limit as to how many nights during the year they can operate as an Airbnb, and that would be 90 days, either consecutively or over the course of a 1-year period. And then for the last category, the investor unit, which is considered commercial short-term rentals, where the whole unit, the whole dwelling is being rented out, and it's not by a resident, but by either an individual or corporate ownership. The same restriction would apply in that they would have to be limited to 90 days during the calendar year and pay a higher registration fee and presumably higher taxes. So many of the goals that the mayor's ordinance set out to achieve are incorporated within the ordinance with respect to concerns about security, quality of life issues within neighborhoods, and enforcement and accountability. The ordinance calls for more data to be produced by these internet platforms so that there's transparency in terms of who's staying there, how often they're staying there, which buildings have these types of short-term arrangements. And so in that respect, it covers a lot of the wish list. There have been, however, several city councilors who have spoken up and had noted that there's significant loopholes in the coverage of the ordinance, particularly when it comes to corporate ownership of short-term rental units. There have been basically 2 points of contention. One is 90 days enough of a deterrent to keep rental units in the housing marketplace, or should it be a lower number, maybe 60 days or 30 days? So that's going to be talked about when the City Council meets at their public hearing on Airbnb, which is going to take place this coming Tuesday, the 13th, at 10 o'clock at City Hall. And the timeline for this process is the ordinance was issued on January 19th by the mayor at City Hall, and the City Council has 2 months from that date to respond to the ordinance, either to approve it in its current state or to make proposals for amendments to the ordinance. And they will work within the Government Operations Committee of the City Council to come up with a recommendation, and then the entire City Council will vote as to whether to approve this ordinance as is or to accept whatever recommendations come out of the subcommittee. So that's one date. Another date, I should add, Mary touched upon this, that we're part of the Alliance of Downtown Civic Organizations, otherwise known as ADCO, and they've been operating for the last year in a subcommittee form with representatives from all over the city, gathering data and providing research, which many of our elected officials have had access to in terms of helping come up with an appropriate response to the mayor's ordinance. And so I would encourage many of you to, if you are interested in getting more information about the ordinance and what other neighborhood organizations think should be included or excluded from the ordinance, there's a website, adco.org, and you can pull down a number of, there are links on that website to the presentation that ADCO is going to give to the City Council on Tuesday. You can get a sneak peek of that presentation if you're interested. On Monday night, I believe, Ford Cavallari, our former president, who is now the chair of ADCO, will be giving a brief presentation to Nunick in this very room on Monday night at 7 o'clock. So if you'd like to come by and hear that, you'll get more information than I've shared with you now. Mary was generous enough to give me 30 minutes. I don't plan on talking much more, but a lot of that is for an opportunity for Q&A on the subject of Airbnb. Again, just a little more background. One of the reasons a lot of our colleagues in other neighborhood associations are concerned about the so-called corporate loophole in the ordinance is that from the data that ADCO's subcommittee has collected over the past year, it turns out that there are 3 to 4 times more corporate ownership of Airbnb units that are being posted on the internet than there are in other major comparable cities that have similar, tight housing markets. So that's a big concern to a number of people, that not only are there apartments being permanently removed from the housing stock for where people can possibly rent out places, but because it's it's creating a scarcity problem. It's putting upward pressure on rents as well. We're seeing that in all the neighborhoods in Boston. So I would encourage you to visit the website, do some research on your own, and if you don't have time to do that, maybe stop by and hear Ford's presentation on Monday night.
I'd just like to add a couple of things to what Dave had to say, and then you'll have an opportunity to ask him questions and to discuss any things. But I also have had an opportunity to speak to representatives of the Beacon Hill Civic Association and Neighborhood Association of the Back Bay, who are addressing this issue in their own neighborhood associations, plus through ADCO as well. And they have decided as a strategic matter that they are going to focus on the investor category in terms of any opposition they have to this. The time frame, as Dave said, is very tight because the City Council is having this hearing now. It's their understanding, and Dave can probably say whether this is correct or not, that if they do not act within the 2-month time frame, that in fact the ordinance that's being proposed will in fact go into effect. The concern of the other neighborhoods is that this investor category of people who are essentially running hotels in residential areas in the neighborhoods will actually be given a legal status that they have never had before. And they're very concerned about that. And I think that it is not unfair to say that in the North End, that is really the category of renters that is of most concern. That it is people who are buying units, or in some instances entire buildings, just for the purpose of running them as short-term rentals. So I think as part of our discussion, perhaps when our discussion is over, I'd like to get some sense of the group as to whether or not NURA would be willing to at least submit a letter to the hearing on Tuesday supporting the other neighborhoods in their position that we would like to see this investor class eliminated from this ordinance at this point in time. And to add to that, they have also said that in reality, other major cities do not have this category in their statute. In addition to that, there have been some studies. I know that Airbnb usually says, well, the investor class is probably about only about 10% of our renters, but just this past week in the New York Times, there was an article that cited a study out of the Yale universities that said, well, yes, they may only be 10% of your renters, but in fact, they're more than 50% of your income. And I think that Dave can probably address this, but I think ADCO is coming up with figures that in the Boston market, it probably will more. So
that's true. The data that ADCO collected and that is incorporated into the presentation has that split between individual hosts, people renting out their residence, versus these corporate hosts where they're basically effectively hotels renting out rooms. The split is actually 30% to 70%, where 70% of the units in Boston that are posted on Airbnb websites are owned by corporate hosts with multiple listings, not just one, but they have several properties throughout the city. And then that's the red flag, that's sort of the telltale, that it's not an individual who's just renting out their home if the same host has multiple listings all over the city. And so what's been happening is a lot of corporations have been buying up properties with the sole intent of essentially running stealth hotel operations in areas of the city where short-term rentals are either a conditional or prohibited use. The way that they get away with that is because of this suspension of ISD enforcement of short-term rental zoning codes that took place in 2014. The city decided to err on the side of conservatism by saying we're going to suspend zoning enforcement on short-term rentals until we can come up with the right regulatory framework for overseeing that. And they were initially going to defer to the state and wait to see what came out of there. That had ran into some problems, and we're going to go through a few reiterations before we finally come up with state legislation that'll sort of provide an umbrella framework for municipalities to draw up their own rules and regulations. So it's going to happen concurrently now. The city's going to come up with its own set of regulations governing short-term rentals, and there'll be an umbrella state legislation that oversees all of it for the entire Commonwealth. Would you like to add to that, Aaron?
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, my update in relation from the state's perspective is that we just released, the committee that I chair, Financial Services, just released a new draft of the legislation that I originally filed back in last year, February. And there's a couple changes related to the legislation, and again, it is an umbrella discussion in the sense, and the reason why it's very challenging from the state's perspective is because we're not just talking about Boston, we're talking about a lot of different communities that are affected by this, and a lot of them have different concerns and issues related to this. And we actually had hearings across the state. We had one in Boston, but we also had one in the Berkshires, we had one in the Cape, because and literally the tone of each hearing was completely different related to what was the biggest concern. Boston, obviously, being where I'm from in my district, I was a little more in tune in what the concerns were from our perspective. But it was interesting to hear from the Berkshires and hear from the Cape in relation to that. But what we're trying to do is create a baseline of regulations and taxation from the state's perspective that will then give the municipalities, whether it be Boston or whatever, the opportunity to build upon that. There is going to be cities and towns in the Commonwealth. Boston is certainly going to be one of them. Cambridge has already kind of put out their beliefs on where they should go. That have already, that are going to weigh in and going to create regulations around this. A lot of other cities and towns may not decide to do that, and the reason being because they may not have the amount of short-term rentals that they feel necessary to kind of, create some system of bureaucracy basically to regulate this. So we were trying to create something that was a baseline of that, and in particular, the first and foremost from the legislation is a registration piece, which would create transparency within the system that you have to file if you want to do a short-term rental. You would have to register as a short-term renter or short-term rental business in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts with the Department of Revenue, and then people would have access to, the public would have access to the locations and the situations that were going on within those short-term rentals. Like, for instance, if I had one in my building that I was not aware of, or I suspected it, instead of going to the door itself and knocking on the door and trying to find out if there was a short-term rental, I could be able to look this up, in a database and be able to get an understanding of what was going on. And the reason why we were so concerned about that is because we had property owners that were having units being rented out that there was no knowledge of, on the short-term rental market. We had condo associations, that were having short-term rental take place that they were not aware. We even had a resident of Emerson College who was renting out his dorm for a couple weeks. A great entrepreneur, renting out his dorm for a couple weeks before Emerson College caught on to him, and then he was shut down. His Airbnb was shut down. So we need to create some transparency within this industry, whether it is in Boston or whatnot. The other thing, one of the big changes, the one change that's probably the biggest change of what was drafted from my original legislation to what is coming out of committee, is that instead of talking about number of days, originally we had 60 days as kind of a baseline of whether you were kind of considered a residential host or potentially one of these investor hosts. We have changed that to the amount of units you have, and it's basically saying if you own anything above 3 units or more than one, or more than in one per municipality. Excuse me, that's a mouthful. One per municipality, then you would then, if you're under that threshold, you'd be considered a residential host. If you're over that threshold, you'd be considered more of an investor host, and then you'd be subject to higher taxes than even the hotel tax. You'd be above the hotel tax, and you'd also be subject to higher liability standards related to insurance and some other factors. We've always been talking about how that we feel that these are different types of business models, that someone who is renting out, lives in the North End, may rent out their unit on an infrequent basis in the North End, but also has a property down the Cape, that wants to rent out their property throughout the summer down the Cape. We don't consider that to be kind of an investor. We kind of see that as a residential host, versus someone who is buying up properties or living in the North End and buying up a bunch of properties and renting all those out to the short-term rental market. We consider that certainly more of the investor host. And we grappled with, we were originally doing days, the amount of days, and that was kind of how we were going backwards from 60 days, 90 days. I know the city has landed on 90 days as what they believe to be the right level. We thought the days would become too complicated related to enforcement of taxation and enforcement, basically like how you tax if someone's at 85 days and then they tax at one rate at 85 days and then the next 10 days or once they go over 90 days, they tax at a different rate, and how do you deal with that? I think DOR would have some real complications with that, and so we felt we wanted to just keep it relatively simple. The last piece outside of insurance, which is $1 million liability insurance, also is the safety inspections. We require that and this is across the Commonwealth, that if you become a short-term rental host, that you have to have your unit inspected, immediately by the municipality to be put on the market. We give some flexibility because, especially at the beginning, there's probably going to be a lot of leeway where the municipality is trying to inspect all these units. But then we set a standard of 5 years that it has to be inspected every 5 years. Municipalities can build upon that and do less time. You could do the municipality can do 2 or 3 years, and if they choose to. But we create a baseline of 5 years that at any short-term rental, a municipality has to inspect that unit once every 5 years to make sure that it's up to safety standards and safety codes. That was the thing we grappled with going back and forth. So that's kind of the legislation as it stands. It's still being tinkered with because it's going to have to go in front of the House Ways and Means Committee and before it even comes to the floor. So there is some other steps. So there may be some other changes, but that's kind of the crux of the issue, and it's something that we've been working on for the last year really. Very hard in terms of how hard we've been trying to nail this down. It's a very complicated issue. It's very much more complicated than meets the eye because there's a whole different types of businesses that are being involved in this short-term rental market. Some are very simple, what you see on Airbnb. Some are very complicated. And we were trying to make sure we struck the right balance related to that to allow this industry to continue to grow in Massachusetts, because there is some positives to it, from the travel and tourism aspect of it to what it provides potentially in some additional revenue to the Commonwealth, but also trying to put the proper protections in place so we don't have issues like we've been seeing from the get-go in this neighborhood and in other neighborhoods in the city of Boston, which was the initial reason why I started getting involved in this issue. I'll also open up the questions too, on top of this, but I do want to just introduce one of my new legislative aide, Ian Key. Ian, you still here? Okay, yeah, he's still there.
I didn't know.
If you can't grab me on anything, and Patrick obviously has been coming to the meetings forever, Ian's going to be around, so please don't hesitate to reach out to him. Okay? So if there's any questions, I'm happy to take.
How does your proposal mesh with the city's proposal? And is that one reason that you didn't have days and they do, or?
No, I think our initial reason for going off the days was just the complexities of implementation and enforcement related to taxation in particular. I believe our proposal, we tried to create a proposal that cities can put the round peg in the round hole. We think that, from our initial perspective of this, I think it would work. I think that what Cambridge has done, I think, will work. I think that other cities and towns will be able to have some flexibility related to this. Cambridge has done owner-occupied only. By our legislation, that can take place. A municipality has the option to build upon however they choose to. And we'll see where this goes through the direction of the city council, and then whatever the mayor eventually signs. I think that we have tried to make it so that it does fit whatever the cities and towns want to do.
Well, I would just like to say one thing that makes more sense. I understand the 90 days when you're working with an area like the Cape where they have summer rentals and it's a whole different population. But in the city here, I mean, I think that we should just completely get rid of the investor class of rentals, because it doesn't serve our neighborhood well. But the 90 days is so concerning to me. We've seen it in Alston, we've seen it in Beacon Hill, we're seeing it here now. We have dorm buildings in our neighborhoods. And so everyone moves in September, and we got the noise at 3 a.m. and the football's down Prince Street at 2 a.m. and the drunken parties, and then they move out in August, And then these absent landlords have 90 days to rent to another transient population until the students come back in September. So those buildings will never become community-oriented buildings. They will always be transient populations if we give them that 90 days. And it's just, it's just replacing one transient population with another. And I think that's really going to destroy our neighborhoods.
Well, I think one of the nice aspects of the state's legislation is that it recognizes that the needs of Boston are different from the needs in Springfield
Right.
and the needs out in Chatham.
Right.
And it's broad enough language so that it's really designed so that the municipalities can sort of place their own particular limits or restrictions on the legislation as they see fit. And whether or not 90 days is the right number for Boston, Michelle Wu came out in the press and said she thought that 90 was too high, that you could basically keep a unit off the market for the whole year by just renting 45 weekends, 2 nights a weekend for 45 weeks, and that's not what the ordinance is aiming to do. So that'll all get hashed out by the city council, and whatever proposals they have, they'll vote on it.
One thing I think that it is going to play itself out, and I have to look at it differently as a city councilor versus what my role was here and what my job was supposed to be. The reason why I got into dealing with this in the beginning is because I didn't like them. And I didn't like what was going on in the North End in particular. And so I came into it with a negative, negative viewpoint. I had to, I tried to find the right balance related to that. But the one thing that I mentioned this, I said this in a couple things in the press that we're talking about on this one proposal. And I don't know why it's not being touted enough necessarily by the mayor or by the city or whatnot. But there is a component, at least from when they explained it to me, where if a unit wanted to go above the 90 days and they wanted to become the investor unit, they would have to then become more of a commercial entity, and they would have to go for I would assume a zoning change, where you go from a residential to a commercial. And if that was the case, then it would come back into the neighborhoods to make a decision on what would happen. And so for that, I thought actually putting the power into the neighborhood's hands wasn't the worst idea in the world. In terms of making that final decision and that being able to go through a zoning process. We as a neighborhood may say then no investors, no anything over 90 days, but some other place may see differently and might have different restrictions depending on what their concerns were. But I thought that bringing the power back into the neighborhood's hands individually was and into to the neighborhood groups and to us as a community was a good step in the right direction. We'll see how it plays out when it goes through the process.
Yeah, Aaron, I'd just like to comment on that, though, from a zoning perspective, that in reality, if you were saying that people have to get a variance in order to do these, the neighborhood as a group can, take a position on it, but we really have no control over it. The only people who really could go into court, for example, on something like that, would be their abutters who might have standing to do that. And the fact is that these investors are very well financed. They're making a bundle of money out of that. And that really puts the burden back on the next door neighbor who is looking at all the garbage and hearing all the parties and seeing all these people coming and going. And so on the surface, I can understand that the city says, oh, well, we're giving it back to the neighborhoods. But if you look at where the money is and where the power is, you aren't really in that perspective. So I think we have to continue to really scrutinize these investor units.
Call me naive or whatnot, or maybe not as cynical, but I believe that I do truly believe that when we do have process in this neighborhood related to zoning, that the neighborhoods, when we work at it and we advocate for it and we fight it, we can win. Certain things, especially if we have a blanket policy. I would argue that especially from the elected official standpoint, I know we're gonna we would if the neighborhood says we want no investors, then we're gonna fight as hard as hell to make sure that there are no investors. But I completely appreciate the because it hasn't always worked out in that favor related to when we have fought DBA problems or the issues in front of the zoning board.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, the question that I guess I have to ask is, and I know you're not naive, believe me, but if in fact, we've already got a gazillion of these here in the neighborhood. So I'm assuming that if, with this category, that they're all okay, right? Do they have to all of a sudden come in?
They would have to come, from what I get, from what I gather in this, they would have to come and they would have to go for zoning changes. You know, that's what I would gather.
Yeah, I guess I'd like to see
If
more
I
about
could,
that.
if I could clarify that, the way the ordinance is crafted by City Hall, it doesn't reference zoning laws at all. The only reference to zoning laws is enforcement, and that has to do with ISD being the enforcing agency for these categories of short-term rentals. So in that regard, Mary is correct in that if the ordinance as it's written now goes through in 2 months' time and allows for this investor class, then no, they won't have to go through any neighborhood review, because they won't need a zoning ordinance, because the City Hall ordinance will allow them to operate as is. So that's something that the City Council is going to be looking at hard. In fact, I believe our elected official, Lydia Edwards, is the co-chair of the committee that's going to be crafting whatever proposals they have to make to the ordinance.
Tom?
If anybody doubts what being a world-class city means, because all the time we're told Boston's a world-class city, take any search engine, put in Barcelona, put in Berlin, put in Venice, you get Venice, Italy, Venice, California, Venice, Florida, put in Rome, and just put in short-term rentals, and you'll be amazed with what you come up with. Just in Berlin alone, the city with the world's toughest anti-Airbnb laws. Barcelona just declared war. Check it out, because that's an eye-opener. These people are preserving their districts, their neighborhoods, their paesi. So it's not anti-market to say it is justifiable to say, does a neighborhood, does a district have a right to say no to an investor class? And so do your own research, and just put in Barcelona and Berlin and see what you get.
Do you have more comments? Okay, I'm sorry, I can't. Diane?
No,
Oh,
sorry.
no, right here. Oh, okay, oh, and sorry, I can't.
I just wanted to really nail down what David said. I think I understood you to address my concerns, but if, as Beacon Hill and whatever are proposing now, to just eliminate the investor class from the city municipal regulation,
The ordinance, yeah.
that will make them a non-permitted use in the city, and therefore they'll all disappear.
Well, there would be
And if there's
non-permitted.
no direction to ISD, there's just a vacuum. There's no direction.
Well, it would be up to ISD to enforce that prohibition on investor class properties.
So lack of a paragraph translates to a prohibition. That's what I want to nail down.
When you say lack of a paragraph, if there are no...
You eliminate from the ordinance reference to an investor class, and then you just said that ISD would have to enforce the prohibition.
That's right.
So the lack of any reference is equivalent to a prohibition.
Yeah, but you'd have to have, the city council would have to vote to change the ordinance as it exists now to
Well,
accomplish
I
it.
understand that, but say they do that, because that was what Mary was suggesting.
Right.
We send a letter in support.
Well, it's not unprecedented either, because other major cities in the United States and around the world, as Tom pointed out, have that arrangement with Airbnb. They have prohibitions against investor class hosts on their website.
Yeah, I would rather out and out. prohibit
San
them
Francisco,
than just
Los
not
Angeles,
talk
New York
about
City,
them.
they all have
That's
restrictions on requiring hosts to be residences of the property that's being rented out.
I absolutely agree. I just don't. Is there an overall statement that uses not specified are automatically prohibited?
Well, I think under our zoning code, I think that in a neighborhood like the North End, that, and Victor, you can correct me on this, but if it is not specified as a permitted use or conditional use, that it would not be permitted, is that correct?
Well, that's correct, but let me add that I support your view of ISD and of zoning not being the answer to control, because the Board of Zoning Appeals gives out variances like candy, which means that although our political representatives may support what the neighborhood, the position the neighborhood has taken, the mayor's office appoints the ZBA. And if there is a difference of opinion, we know that the candy will continue to be distributed.
So, Dave Roderick?
Yeah. Dave Roderick, Prince Street. That thing about the city, they just keep saying dwelling. Are they ever going to make a distinction between condos that have condo associations and a building that's owned by like one person? That's the landlord. Because now what happens if you have a condo building with like 10 units? Say 5 of them, you got 5 absentee landlords because they own the unit but they're not there.
Most condo associations have their own rules specifically.
Would they be
allowing or
overridden by
disallowing
these regulations?
subleasings. Well,
Would there be a
the
legal
condo
hassle?
rules would supersede any of the city regulations. If they say we don't want this in our building, then they don't really need to rely on the city ordinances. Many condo associations do that. They don't allow short-term rentals. They don't even allow subleasing some condos.
No commercial uses?
No commercial uses, and so the condos can handle that problem. This is more about rental units in the city.
So these investors that buy condo units, and if that condo association doesn't have stuff, or if they already own the units and the condo association is outvoted if they were trying to add stuff.
Well, what a lot of these
problem.
booking agents, you
Yeah.
can call them, who utilize Airbnb and other internet platforms do is that they'll allow, they won't buy the units. They may just lease them from the owners and say, look, we'll handle all the maintenance issues, we'll handle the tenancy and everything like that. Don't worry about it. And then they just post it on Airbnb and make the money that way. So it's mostly a rental unit phenomenon that the ordinance is addressing, but it applies to whether it's a triple decker in Southie or a newly built luxury apartment building in Bullfinch Triangle. They're all going to be subject to the same ordinance.
It seems like there could be a conflict about the management companies involved in the building also, in the insurance, things like that. Okay. Thank you.
We have time for maybe one more comment. David?
Yeah, Steve, that's it.
Oh, Steve, yes, sure.
I have a comment and a question.
Sure.
First, was your intent, you had started out talking about a potential letter in some fashion. Are we going to be able to turn anything around for a meeting that you said was going to be Tuesday?
Well, that's my question. I'd like to ask for a show of hands as to whether there is support in this group for submitting just a very brief letter on behalf of NURA, saying that in conjunction with the other neighborhood associations, we do support the elimination of the investor category from this proposed ordinance.
And just to clarify, the Tuesday public hearing at City Hall with the City Council is just that, a public hearing. They're not going to be voting on the ordinance in that meeting. They're going to be listening. It'll probably last several hours, and they'll be listening to people coming up and giving their own testimony as to what they support or oppose about the mayor's ordinance. And then again, they have until 2 months after the issuance of the ordinance to either vote in a proposal through the entire City Council or to leave it as is and it become effective as is.
Thank you, David. That's helpful.
The problem is we
Personally,
don't...
my comment would be that, yes, we should send a letter eliminating the third category. But I would also prefer to see the second category be scaled back to no more than 60. I think 90 is too many. And I did read most of the ordinance proposal, and I did read, I don't remember where, Michelle Wu's comments. Maybe she was right when she said, well, we could rent it every weekend,
Sure.
and you would still And if there's that loophole, it will be taken advantage of. And in a neighborhood like this, I think 60 days is more than enough.
Well, I think we could certainly, if that's the sense of the group, we could certainly add that into. My concern is this, that as David has pointed out, they do have 2 months. However, we don't really know when the city council is going to take this up. And we can't guarantee that it won't be before our next meeting. So we don't really have, I mean, I think individual members can comment, and we might have time to supplement our comments, but I think that the general sense is, as the guy from the Neighborhood Association of the Back Bay said, there's a lot to not like about this ordinance. However, we are really feeling that we need to focus on the investor category because that is really the most important battle for us right now.
He's only talking about adding a sentence or two, right?
So, well, I guess,
But without implying that we support the rest of the ordinance. We don't even know it really well.
well, we don't, right. Well, and I think that, I mean, I think that we can draft something just pretty short, you know, that says that the, you know, we really have not had the opportunity as a neighborhood to fully digest this because it is a very complicated issue, but that one stand that we can take is that we do not want this investor category in our neighborhood. And I mean, I guess I'll ask is, for a show of hands, do people support taking a stand like that? How many would like to take that stand? Okay. And how many would not like to take that position? Okay, so I think that
How much more work is it to add 60 days versus 90 in a letter?
well, it's not much work at all if people want that added in. I mean, can I have another show of hands? How many people would like us to say we think that there should not be more than 60 days under any circumstances? Show of hands on that?
For any of the categories we're talking about now, or?
I guess
For residents, they can't do it more than 60 days.
No, there are two classes where one is subject to 90 days, and that's the person who actually resides in the unit and goes away for seasonal purposes. The first class, there are no date limits on someone renting out a room in their home or a floor in their house.
So it looks like we're adding that in as well. That we would like to limit it to 60 days.
The newer will draft a letter, but I would encourage anyone who feels strongly about this subject to compose a brief email stating the same things and sending it off to your favorite city councilor, letting them know that this isn't something that works with you, and that's how people feel.
Very handy. So I would email
And if people still have more questions that they'd like to ask from an informed person, again, I encourage you to attend the big meeting this Monday night and listen to Angela's presentation.